fork, I don't know, you can correct me on this, is, well, broadly ideas for scaling.
Yes.
And more specifically, sort of layer 2 or layer 1 and 2 intersection ideas of how to achieve scaling. And at the core of that is the idea of sharding. So first, what is sharding?
Okay. So there's two major paradigms for scaling blockchains, right? As you said, layer 1 and layer 2. And layer 1 basically means make the blockchain itself capable of processing more transactions by having, some mechanism by which it can do that, despite the fact that there's a limit to the capacity of each participant in the blockchain. And then layer 2 says, well, we're going to keep the blockchain as is, but we're going to create clever protocols that sit on top of the blockchain that still use the blockchain and then still kind of inherit things like the security guarantees of a blockchain. But at the same time, a lot of things are done off-chain, and so you get more scalability that way. So in Ethereum, the most popular paradigm for layer 2 is rollups, and the most popular paradigm for layer 1 is sharding.
So one way to achieve layer 1 scaling is to increase the block size.
Yes.
Hence the block size wars, quote unquote. And you actually tweeted something about people are saying that Vitalik changed his mind about he went from being a small blocker,
it went from being big to small.
Big to small. To and but you said I've been a medium blocker all along. So maybe you can also comment on the very basic aspect before we even get to sharding of where you stand on this block size debate.
Sure. So the way that I think about the trade-off is I think about it as a trade-off between making it easy to write to the blockchain and making it easy to read the blockchain. Right. So when I say read, I just mean, have a node and actually verify it and make sure that it's correct and all of those things. And then by write, I mean send transactions. So I think for decentralization, it's important for both of these tasks to be accessible. And I think that they're about equally important, right? If you have a chain that's too expensive to read, then everyone will just trust a few people to read for them. And then those people can change the rules without anyone else's permission. But if, on the other hand, it becomes really expensive to write, then everyone will move on to basically second layer systems that are incredibly centralized. And that takes away from, decentralization and self-sovereignty as well. So this has been my viewpoints pretty much the whole time, right? It's that you need this balance, and going in one direction or the other direction is very unhealthy. In the Bitcoin case, basically what happened was that Bitcoin originally, at the very beginning, it didn't really have a block size. It just had an accidental block size of 32 or block size limit of 32 megabytes, because that just happens to be the limit of the peer-to-peer messages. But then,
interesting. I didn't even know that part.
Yeah, but then Satoshi back in 2010 was worried that even 32 megabyte blocks would be too hard to process, so he put the limit down to 1 megabyte. And I think
by put, you mean sneaked in there?
Yeah, just made an update to the Bitcoin software that made blocks bigger than one. I think it's 1 million bytes invalid. And I think the impression that most people had at the time is that, this is just a temporary safety measure. And over time, as we become more confident in the software, that limit would be raised somewhat. But back then, when the actual usage of the blockchain started going up, and then it started going up first to 100 kilobytes per block, then to 250 kilobytes per block, then to 500 kilobytes per block, there started kind of coming out of the woodworks this opinion that no, that limit should just not be increased. And then there were all of these attempts at compromising, right? First there was a proposal for 20 megabyte blocks. Then there was the 248 proposal, which is a bit ironic because the 248 proposal started off being a small block negotiating position. But then when the big block people came back and said hey, aren't we going to do this? They're oh, no, we don't want the block size increases anymore. So there were these two different positions, right? The small blockers, I think they valued 1 megabyte blocks for two reasons. One is that they just really, really believe in the importance of being able to read the chain. But two is that a lot of them really believe in maintaining this norm of never hard forking, right? So the difference between a hard fork and a soft fork is basically that in a soft fork, blocks that were any block that's valid under the new rules was still valid under the old rules. So if you have a client that verifies according to the old rules, then you'll still be able to accept the chain that follows the new rules. Whereas with a hard fork, like you have to update your code in order to stay on the chain.
Mm-hmm.
And look, they have this belief that, soft forks are kind of either less coercive than hard forks, which, by the way, I completely disagree with. I actually think soft forks are more coercive because, like, basically they force everyone who disagrees to sort of go along by default. Or they have this opinion that there's like, it's more difficult to abuse soft forks to do really mean things or that like completely violate people's expectations, like increasing the supply, which is like, I think there is some truth to that. So because of, these reasons, they just say we're only going to do soft forks and we want to just not do any hard forks. And they eventually discovered this idea called segregated witness that allows for like a very tiny block size increase to like the equivalent of about 2 megabytes with a soft fork. It's just a really like weird and devious trick. Like basically what they do is they take the signatures of transactions and then they put them outside of the block, and then they add an extra rule that says that like for a block to be valid, the block has to come with a separate like basically extension block that contains all of the transaction signatures. Right. So, when you measure it according to the old rules, like, hey, it adds up to less than 1 million, but actually there's this extension block that the old protocol doesn't even know about. So
it's a hack that seemed to work to in a small way extend the size of the block size.
But so, small block side was like happy with these very low levels of block size, and then the big block side wanted to expand to, at the very least go to 4 megabytes, then, maybe 8, 20. There's disagreements within there as well. I definitely was favoring the big side the whole way through, as you can probably tell. But
even though, so the argument against the big is that it makes things more centralized.
Yes, because fewer people can run a node that verifies the chain, and also because any of these things would require a hard fork, and hard forks are inherently risky.
Do you think there's truth to that?
I'm pro hard fork. I think hard forks are actually like in a political economic sense, they're better than soft forks.
Well, I think hard forks is the right way to make changes because then everybody's forced to make a decision. Right. Do you accept this change or not, as opposed to ideas being sneaked in behind the door and the decision is forced on you?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, but hard fork, some people say, this is when they talk about sort of Ethereum, is there's some aspect to a hard fork where you're trying to upgrade a airplane while it's flying. And
I think soft forks are also upgrading an airplane while it's flying.
But it's a smaller upgrades.
That's there's some truth to that. Like there's definitely a bit more risk of like a split as a result of a hard fork than as a result of a soft fork.
And this split is highly undesirable, right?
Well, it depends. Like if it's a split because of a bug, then that's horrible. If it's a split as a result of political differences, then I think like a split is better than, one side being forced to basically just like suck it up and accept the majority position, even if it really hates it.
Well, there's also political connections throughout the history of the United States. It's like sometimes groups of people that strongly disagree with each other should be forced to work it out, even when a split seems like an easy thing in the short term.
It depends. And I think for blockchains in particular, the costs of people being able to like peacefully go off and do their own thing are much lower, right? Like, okay, if you have a country and you have two groups, then like often enough, like fighting out the new rules requires, a civil war, requires everyone to move and so forth. But no, on a blockchain, like, the costs are lower. And so.
So if you were to look at the way things worked out with the block size wars and there was a split, what is it, Bitcoin Cash and
Bitcoin.
Would you, putting on your historian hat, you mentioned offline, you like Dan Carlin. So if Dan Carlin were to do an episode on the on the block size wars, do you think it could have turned out better, or are you okay with the way it turned out?
I'm definitely disappointed with what happened with the big block side. Um, I think the source of my disappointment is that, like, one of the things that you notice when just looking at like these political disagreements generally, especially when you have environments where they're authoritarian or like single party dominated, and then there's some opposition party, and the opposition often has like very legitimate grievances, but at the same time, the thing you notice is that often enough the opposition just sucks, right? Like it just doesn't have political capacity. It doesn't have like the ability to come up with policy because its entire culture is like designed around resisting much more, and then it's designed around like actually debating serious policy trade-offs. And I worry, or I guess not so much worry because it's already happened. I unfortunately think that Bitcoin Cash ended up being a victim of this, right? Like first, there was the split with Bitcoin Cash, and then of course Craig Wright came in, and Craig Wright was this basically scammer who just keeps on pretending that he is Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin. Hey, Craig Wright's legal team, do you hear me? Yes, I still think your client is a scammer, so sue me.